Thank you, President Santos, for chairing that excellent session, and I want to thank everyone again for their contributions. Today, the world has come together in a coalition of the committed to expose, to punish, and to drive out corruption. This has been the first summit of its kind, and the biggest demonstration of the political will to address corruption that we have seen for many, many years. And frankly, we've known for years what a problem this is. We've known for years it prevents us from achieving so many things we want to fix in our world. But I really sense that today there is far more political will, not just for words, but for action that will make a difference. And frankly, there's nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come. And I believe that is the case with fighting and driving out corruption. When the United Kingdom hosted the G8 in Loch Earn in 2013, we took what many had seen as a series of technical issues around tax and trade and transparency, and we showed how political will could begin a concerted effort to get to grips with tax evasion, aggressive tax avoidance, and corporate secrecy. When we first talked about ideas like the automatic exchange of tax information and registries about who owned each company, many people, I think, wondered what on earth we were on about and whether any of these things would actually happen. But now 129 jurisdictions have committed to implementing the international standard for tax information on request, and more than 95 have committed to implementing the new Global Common Reporting Standard on tax transparency. And as the head of the OECD, Angel Gurria, said today, this started, in his words, a dramatic revolution that has since brought in 50 billion euros in extra tax revenue and has the potential, with automatic exchange of information, to bring in 200 billion more. Think of the schools, the hospitals, the roads, the services that can be provided with that previously lost money. So today's summit is built on those foundations. And today it's not just the G8, but it's representatives from over 40 countries, not just political leaders, but leaders from business, from civil society, and from sport too, all working together to produce a series of groundbreaking commitments that can really transform our ability to tackle corruption. And just as at Loch Earn, many of these agreements are quite technical, but their impact is, I believe, far-reaching. First, we'll expose corruption, so there is nowhere to hide. If you don't know who owns what, you can't stop people stealing from poor countries and hiding that stolen wealth in rich ones. That is why it's so important that 5 countries have agreed to create public registers of beneficial ownership, and 6 more will explore similar arrangements. This will mean that everyone in the world will be able to see who really owns and controls each and every company in these countries. The EU, Iceland, UAE, and most of our overseas territories and crown dependencies with major financial centres have agreed to automatically exchange their entire registries of beneficial ownership information. This means that law enforcement agencies across the world will be able to access this data, in many cases for the first time, and use it to expose the corrupt. Does it need to go further? Yes, of course it does, but today is a good start. It's no use having laws against corruption if lawyers, accountants, and estate agents find ways around those laws. So that's why it's so important that at this summit, a new professional services statement of support has shown unprecedented commitment from these professions to stop the facilitation of corruption. Again, does this go far enough? Does this need to go further? Of course it does. We need this adopted in every country, not just in some. Public procurement and construction. They have been massive areas for corruption around the world over years. So a range of countries, including the UK, will now use open contracting in their government procurement to keep public money out of corrupt hands. And here in the UK, we want to clean up our property market and show there is no home for the corrupt in Britain. So all foreign companies which own properties in the UK will have to register publicly who really owns them, who really controls them. And no foreign company will be able to buy UK property or bid for central government contracts without joining this register. Next, we're going to do more to punish the perpetrators of corruption and to support those affected by it. We know that corruption is a global phenomenon, so it's essential that we share information and pursue the corrupt across borders, joining the dots to identify and prosecute the corrupt and to seize their assets, a point that so many speakers have made today. So the new International Anti-Corruption Coordination Centre that we are creating will help police and prosecutors work together to do just that. But we also need to ensure that when we expose the corrupt, we're able to seize their assets and return them to the countries from which they were stolen. That is why the new Global Forum for Asset Recovery will be so important, enabling governments and law enforcement agencies around the world to work together to achieve this. We've also agreed today that 22 countries will introduce new asset recovery legislation. 14 will strengthen their protections for whistleblowers, a discussion we had in the last session. And 11 countries will review the penalties for companies that fail to prevent tax evasion. Here in Britain, we're going to consult on extending that offence of failure to prevent tax evasion to include other offences like fraud, like money laundering, and we hope others will follow this lead. We want firms properly held to account for any criminal activity within them. We're also consulting on unexplained wealth orders, reversing the burden of proof. So if someone is suspected of corruption, the onus is on them to prove they acquired their wealth legitimately, or they will face having it stripped from them by a court. Now, third, we will do more, as was discussed earlier, to drive out corruption wherever it's found. This requires political leadership, the leadership we've seen today, and a sustained effort at changing cultures of corruption. One example of this is the twinning of different countries' tax inspectors, as was just being discussed, to help build cultures of probity and honesty. And today we've seen 17 countries commit to such partnerships between their institutions and their professions. And I want to thank Professor Paul Collier for his great work on this subject. We've also had a very frank discussion today about changing cultures in sport. The world loves sport, and the world knows that sport can be riddled with corruption. So only when we deal with corruption in sport will people really believe that we're dealing with corruption more broadly. Today we've taken an important step towards an international sport integrity partnership that would restore integrity to the games we love, and we'll be keeping up pressure to land this at a meeting with the IOC in February. We're also raising our own standards of governance and transparency to the highest possible levels here in the UK through the new Sports Charter. But today's summit hasn't just been about securing these agreements, important as they are. We've also held, I think you would agree, a different kind of event. Instead of simply having speeches, talking to ourselves about what we've agreed, we've had open, honest, and challenging conversations. We've asked tough questions about the challenges in implementing these agreements and explored new ideas and the next steps that can really raise the ambition further. We've asked whether we could enforce action against corruption in the same way we enforce action against terrorism. We've been challenged to protect the freedom of the press and whistleblowers, so vital in helping to expose the corrupt. We've talked about the need for more action from multinational companies. There was a great challenge for anti-corruption organisations to work more closely together to deliver a more coordinated effort. And we've talked about the need for every country to ultimately reach what I would call the gold standard of having a public register of beneficial ownership. And I'm clear that I include all the overseas territories and crown dependencies in that. But it was encouraging to hear praise for what the head of the OECD described as, and I quote, the exemplary delivery of our crown dependencies and the steps that they've taken so far. Finally, we've been clear that this summit will not be a single one-off moment. We are building a global movement against corruption. As President Ghani said, this cannot be a fashion. We have to stay the course on this for the next 10 years and beyond. We welcome the commitment from Japan to include this issue and the learnings of this summit in their G7 presidency. We've agreed we'll meet again at the UN General Assembly next year. And in the meantime, we will continue to track the implementation of everything we've agreed today. And let's just be clear about what these agreements really add up to. As I said, some of them are technical. But what we're talking about is stopping the corrupt hiding their loot from the authorities. So as John Kerry said, there are no more safe harbours for the corrupt. It means that when people steal money from your country and hide it in mine, we can expose them and return the money to you. It means getting stolen assets returned to people like President Buhari and President Ghani so they can be reinvested in the future of their countries. It means cleaning up our property market right here in London. It means helping to secure for all our economies some of the trillions in potential economic growth that is needlessly lost to corruption. It means building an unprecedented global coalition to tackle this cancer of corruption, which destroys jobs, traps the poorest in poverty, and as Sarah Chase has argued so powerfully today, even undermines our security. It means quite simply winning the battle against one of the greatest enemies of progress in our time. I say again, if we want to tackle poverty, if we want to beat extremism, if we want to narrow the gap between the richest countries in the world and the poorest countries in the world, we have to tackle corruption. This is our mission. This is the vital work that we've begun today, and I want to thank everyone for their contributions. Thank you. Thank you very much. We've got a little bit of time for some final questions for anyone who feels they were left out, or perhaps one or two questions from the press. Let's start with, I think we've got Sky News here.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Dominic Wack on Sky News. If I could ask, first of all, about a topic which I'm sure concerned people here before we get on to a theme that came up again and again today. On the subject of the Euro referendum, the supposedly independent chairman of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, has predicted a recession if Britain leaves Europe during the European Union referendum. Could you say whether you think that's right for him to wade into that argument? And on the same topic, who you are more afraid of in a debate, Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage? But on the subject of anti-corruption, the summit here, one topic that's come up again, there seems to be consensus that offshore tax havens are a huge problem. Many of them are, or some of them are, British dependencies, and I know you've managed to persuade 40 offshore havens and jurisdictions and countries to agree to do more to pool information about the true ownership of companies. But how can you persuade them to do more to do what Britain has done today, which is actually make that information public? And will you use your power and influence to force British dependencies to do so if they don't do so voluntarily?
Okay, thank you very much. Let's start with the Bank of England. I mean, this is not just the governor of the Bank of England. This is the entire Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, who are independent by law. And they have said very clearly that their fear is that if we leave the EU, that will lead to higher prices and lower growth. And they have warned about the risk of a recession. Now, they are totally independent from government. Their job is to tell it like it is and to warn of risks in the economy. And they couldn't be more clear that there is a risk. And I think that is a very clear message. At the same time, you've got today one of the leading lights of the Remain campaign, Peter Hargreaves, saying, and I quote, when it comes to leaving the EU, that would lead to insecurity. And I quote, he says, insecurity is fantastic. Well, insecurity might be fantastic if you're a hedge fund manager. Insecurity is not fantastic if you are a car worker or a farmer or a student setting out in your life wondering what your career is going to hold. It's not fantastic if you're looking for a job, if you're trying to feed your family, if you're concerned about the future of our economy and the future of our prosperity. So frankly, I think these two statements today put the whole debate into a very, very clear picture. Here is the Leave campaign celebrating insecurity and putting our economy at risk. And here is the Monetary Policy Committee of our independent Bank of England warning about the risk of recession. That is why I think the right answer is for Britain to stay in a reformed European Union. Now, on the issue of debates, I'm very much looking forward to getting out there on the television and talking direct to voters and answering questions in town hall meetings as I did at the election. But I'm very keen to demonstrate that the Remain campaign is not just a campaign with a Conservative Prime Minister. It consists of the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, trade unions, voluntary bodies, large businesses, small businesses, and people who've never had anything to do with politics at all. And so I want to make sure, as we have these town hall debates and discussions and everything else, that the Remain campaign is able to demonstrate that it is not simply an argument between Conservatives, it's actually Conservatives and Labour and Liberals and all the rest. And so I look forward to doing that. Third question was the issue of Crown dependencies and overseas territories. I just make a couple of points. One is they have moved a huge amount of distance in terms of transparency and openness, and all of them have committed to having registers of beneficial ownership, and crucially, most of them now have committed to the automatic exchange of information and automatically sharing those registers of beneficial ownership with other countries. Now that puts them ahead of many developed countries and even states inside the United States of America in terms of what they're prepared to do. So it's been an easy target for the press and campaigners and other countries, indeed, to point at the overseas territories and crown dependencies in the past. I think it's quite difficult to do that now because they have raised their game to the extent that the OECD has said that they have shown exemplary leadership in this. What I'd say is something I think the Maltese Prime Minister put very well. Look, there are plenty of places in the world that are financial centres. Indeed, we're standing in one right now. There are plenty of places in the world that are financial centres that want to encourage finance, that want to encourage jobs, that want to make sure that business can be done easily and inexpensively, who believe in having low tax rates, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think we should recognize that's okay. What's not been okay is secrecy and turning a blind eye to dirty money and all the rest of it. But we have to say to not just overseas territories, but small island states or other countries that are financial centers, there is a respectable and deliverable model where you are a good center for business, but you're a good center for honest business. And part of what today is all about is saying, if we all raise our game, and we all raise the bar of what we want to achieve, then actually we can have fair competition between different countries and different destinations rather than encouraging bad practice. And I would say I think that's what the overseas territories and crown dependencies have really demonstrated in their action in the run-up to the summit today. Let's have gentleman here.
Thanks very much, Prime Minister. Joel Hills from ITV News. I wanted to ask you firstly, actually, and very briefly, off message a little, given the summit, but ITV is being threatened with legal action over its EU referendum programme. I'd like you to wonder if you comment on that. But firstly, I mean, picking up on this issue, you've mentioned the names of the jurisdictions that have signed, which even critics concede is progress. Jersey, Gibraltar, Montserrat, Cayman Islands, Bermuda. The British Virgin Islands hasn't signed, Prime Minister. Britain has considerable influence over the British Virgin Islands. Why won't you use it to impose change?
Well, let's be clear about what they've been asked to sign up to, because I think what's happening here is all the work they've done, even including the British Virgin Islands, is being forgotten. There are basically three things I asked them to sign up to. One was the automatic exchange of tax information. The second was signing up to the common reporting standards so we can see where companies are making their profits. And the third was having a register of ownership. Now, as far as I'm concerned, all of them have either committed or are in the process of committing to those three things. Then the next thing we asked them to do was to say, we want you to go even further, bearing in mind that there are European countries that don't have registers of beneficial ownership. So I then asked them to go even further and say we want the automatic exchange of that information, which the overwhelming majority have done, and I'm convinced will persuade the remainder to do. I would rather do that than any enforcement action. And if you think how far they've come in the last few weeks and months, and indeed how much has been done since the Lochern Summit of 2013, I feel quite confident as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to say that I'm convinced we'll get them all over that bar. Then, of course, there's the goal. Let's have public registers of beneficial ownership. But let's be frank, as we stand today, we've got Norway, we've got Britain, we've got a handful of other countries that have them, a handful that have committed. But as I keep saying, the gold standard, and what I will push for, as long as there's breath in my body, is for everybody to do that. And not just picking on small islands, but I'd like to see, the United States of America, China, India, everybody do it. And that's what this is all about. So they come a hugely long way. As for ITV election, I'm not going to get into that. I think I'll leave others. I haven't really had time to read all of these increasingly excitable press releases that seem to have been shooting around. So I'll take a bit of leisure time tonight to have a look at what the Leave campaign have been saying. But I'm very happy to appear on your channel. Patrick Wintour from The Guardian.
Thank you. You talked earlier about the coalition of the committed, and talking around earlier to some of the overseas territories, they were very resentful that they felt they were being put in the dock in a way in which America is not. And I was wondering whether you feel there is a kind of constitutional problem in America where there's about 2 or 3 states which particularly are acting in a way which is kind of pretty questionable. and the American administration simply says it's a matter for Congress and for those states. Is this a really big roadblock that you need to address?
Well, I think this is going to be a journey. Remember, we started back in 2013 when the idea of registers of ownership were a relatively new thing. As you've indicated, and as I've said, lots of countries are making progress. G7 countries all had to have action plans. The overseas territories and crown dependencies have actually gone quite a long way towards it. Britain has gone the furthest. There are challenges in the US. I mentioned it at Prime Minister's Questions this week that, and it was mentioned here that, the state of Delaware, for instance, has lots of companies registered and not much transparency over them. So we just have to work with all these countries to persuade them that in the end, if we all raise the bar, it will be more effective. But I'm committed to doing that, and the United States should certainly be included in that. Any last points from NGOs or anybody else? We'll take one more, and then I think we'll finish.
Martin Tiesny from a Media Network. Prime Minister, much of the agenda for the summit has to do with information being made available, but I think we all agree that in order for change to happen, that information needs to be used. It acts both as a deterrent, but also for corruption prosecutions. For this to happen, we'll need some quite unusual collaborations between law enforcement and investigative NGOs, such as Global Witness, and the media. In some countries, this happens fairly well. In other countries, it's much harder to have those collaborations, again, between law enforcement, investigative NGOs, the media, civil society, data scientists. How do you think the summit can contribute towards those collaborations in the next few months? Thank you.
It's a very good point. I think we need to build on what we have. I mean, at the moment, you have financial experts in one place, you have law enforcement in another place, and you have journalists and NGOs in a third. And I think to start with, we need to get financial expertise and law enforcement together, which is actually what we've done in response to the Panama Papers, bringing together a task force that includes great investigators with financial experts, so you really know what you're going after. I think there's another step, which is actually to bring to bear some of the resources in terms of intelligence and policing that states like Britain and others have, and make sure, yes, of course it should be directed against terrorism, but actually why not direct a little bit of it against money laundering, illicit financial flows, and the rest of it. I think with some effort we'd make a big difference. Then we come to the issue of how we work with journalists. And obviously that's sensitive because journalists want to be, quite rightly, fully independent from government and investigations. I suppose the plea I would make is that when there are treasure troves of information discovered, I hope that journalists feel that they can take early opportunities to share that with law enforcement, because there may be, in the parts of the Panama Papers or whatever we haven't yet seen, there may be evidence of wrongdoing which would help us to prosecute the guilty and achieve convictions. So I think there'll need to be a bit of trust and a bit of working together. But I think the whole theme of today's conference has been, if we work together and if we all raise the bar, we can solve this global problem. And that's what today has been all about. Thank you very much indeed.